main thing for founders I always like to say is don't fundraise for the sake of fundraising, right? That's a key point that I don't really like to see founders coming in to say, hey, I just need X amount of money because my company is worth this amount of money, when firstly, you might not be at the right time, or you don't really actually need the money. And what's wrong with running an SME, right? So, and not everyone firstly needs to go down that path, or not everyone has the ability to go down that path.
Hi, everyone. Today's guest is Wayne So. Wayne is the VP of Investments, APAC, and head of Singapore at Plug and Play, where he leads the Singapore team and oversees early stage investments across Asia.
Don't think about fundraising and getting into the numbers game, because once you get external money, pressure comes. The clock starts ticking, and then you have limited time to raise your next round of funding, right? Or to even get to the exit at the end of the day. Life is not just about, chasing that exit dream and the valuation dream itself.
Tell us a little bit more about your role at Plug and Play, especially serving as VP of APAC Investments. We chatted a little bit about it on a train ride to Daegu, and I know there's just so much exciting work that you do in your space that we'd be excited to learn about.
The role that I've been working in Plug and Play has evolved quite a bit. So I think when I joined, I was kind of the first full-time employee in Singapore for Plug and Play. Singapore is actually the very first overseas office for Plug and Play. And
I
now
didn't
we
know
have
that.
offices. Yeah, we have offices in about 60 plus locations around the world. I was the only person in Plug and Play for about a good 4 or 5 years before we started bringing in accelerator programs into the Singapore office, and then our corporate innovation programs. And now we have about 30 to 40 people across Southeast Asia, and probably about 200 plus people across Asia itself. Yeah, so I think that's kind of like how I got started. And today I cover investments across mainly Southeast Asia, South and Southeast Asia, but I also look at investments across Asia as well, right? So working with the other teams, and also sometimes doing direct investments from our office as well. And essentially, I call myself investments lead, but that I do also a lot of other things, right? So I do support our other teammates in terms of running some of the programs that we have, working with some of our corporate partners and our government partners across the region, and anywhere else that the team needs to be traveled to, right? That's where I go, and that's how I met Katie, in Korea for the last 2 years, right? So it's become a annual pilgrimage right now to support some of our teammates in Korea, and it's also the local startup ecosystem over there.
What an incredible start and career. Congratulations on your 15-year anniversary with Plug and Play. You spent some time in Silicon Valley. You were an entrepreneur yourself. Walk us through that pre-venture capital journey a little bit. And I really want to know about the Enclave Hostel because we've never talked about that.
So my founder and entrepreneurship story, um, it kinds of overlaps quite a bit here and there, even with my time in Plug and Play itself, right? But I actually spent a year living in Silicon Valley, not as a founder, but I was working in a startup called Quick. And interestingly, it was part of this program called the NUS Overseas College, right? So it's NUS stands for the National University of Singapore. So where I studied computer science, right? So this very exciting program has been around till date, probably 25 to 30 years. And the goal was actually to send students like myself at a point in time to different parts of the world, including Silicon Valley, to have a taste of what founder startup life is about, right? So we actually did full time work in a startup in a overseas location, and then we also took classes, kind of like part time. So for us in Silicon Valley, we took classes from Stanford. And then at the point in time, there was like places like Philly, where we were partnered with University of Pennsylvania, and then we also had Stockholm, and one or two other locations. But today, that program has expanded to like 5 or 6 different other locations right now,
Wow.
right? So including Beijing and Shanghai in China. That kind of started my whole interest in startup life, right? Because even when I was here working for Quick, the 1 year I saw many ups and downs, right? For example, and this was July 2008 to July 2009, right? So
What a
it kind of,
time.
yes. So you remember the timing, right? So it's the property crisis happened there during the period. The first 6 months we were hiring, expanding like crazy, and then the next 6 months we were just crashing, right? So trying to survive. People were let go. We're trying to struggling to find investors, or even the VCs were interested to invest, but then they were not able to release funds because they were not able to draw down from the LPs at the point in time. So it's a roller coaster ride, but it's kind of like the reality of what startups would be like. So that kind of was my first official time in the startup, and since then I've been in and out of many startups. Right, so I came back to Singapore after my time in Silicon Valley, started a few companies with friends. One was a Groupon clone when Groupon hasn't expanded to Asia yet. And so, uh, interestingly, my lesson learned during that time in that company was that um, uh, maybe copying is not too bad a thing, right? Because I was trying to figure out what the competitive advantage was, trying to be different when maybe just copying it would work much better. Yeah, that's one. The other startup that I played around with was actually a virtual reality startup. We're trying to build virtual reality toys for kindergarten school children.
Interesting. I didn't know that. What was your favorite virtual reality toy that you made?
We actually only tried one, which was very interesting, which was actually a cube with multiple sides with the QR code, all right? Because that QR code was able to, when the computer tracks the QR code, it creates a whole like a Sim City world where kids were able to kind of place this world and play around with it virtually on the computer setup, right? But firstly, I felt that it was a bit too ahead of its time. Remember this is like 2009, 2010.
Mhm.
And then we couldn't find the right form factor, which we could firstly package and sell. And secondly, the kids could play on a regular basis, right? So we tried testing out with schools. The students loved it, but I don't think they want to buy it, right? Just so I think that's the key thing. A lot of the schools didn't want to buy it because of the cost involved, and then because it was only like an incremental fun thing. I think a lot of schools still preferred focusing on physical, real world toys, right? So I think that was the
Mhm.
time we tried working on that, right? So after that, I joined Plug and Play, right? So because the two startups failed. We had initial traction, but I think it didn't find product market fit at all. And the good thing is we didn't raise any funds for these two startups, so I was able to kind of pack up and go immediately. So off and on after, even after Plug and Play, and my boss always likes to exaggerate this, all right? Because I think 4 or 5 years down the road, and Plug and Play, I had the what they call it, itchy hands again, right? Trying to get my hands dirty and trying to start my own company. That's how I started two things, right? One was Proper Hands, which is essentially a home cleaning marketplace, matching cleaners with homes and offices. And that did okay. We raised a seed round for it, and then 3 years down the road, I decided to shut it down because again, product market fit wasn't there. And the problem with that idea is that there's a lot of demand for it, but the supply was never there. Right? So
Hmm.
essentially, how can you find cleaning, let's say, manpower and resources from Singapore, which is already a very small country, right? And also trying to make it legal in the first place. Yeah, we had a lot of not very legal sources coming to us, trying to find work for these folks when technically they're not allowed to work in homes or in Singapore at that point in time. Right? So does it make sense for us to be non-ethical and sending uh, illegal workers into people's homes and offices, right? So I think that kind of stuck for 3 years, and then I came back to Plug and Play, and then in the middle, I think Enclave Hostel was I would say a side project in that sense. So interestingly, in Singapore at a point in time, there was a bit of a dormitory crunch.
Mhm.
So students, especially exchange students coming to Singapore for like 6, 12 months, they couldn't get easy access to dorms in school because firstly, Singapore is small, right? So even the universities had issues with the spaces available in the local dormitories. So they prioritize, for example, full-time students in Singapore. So because of that, right, the exchange students, those that came in just for 3, 6, 12 months, they didn't get easy access to live in those on-campus dormitories. Um, because of that, and coincidentally, we found a bit of a space just outside National University of Singapore, so it's a bit of a small, um, in Singapore we call it a shop house unit, right? So it's like 2 stories. On the first floor, it's like restaurants and eateries, and usually catering a bit of the student crowd as well as the supper crowd in the region. And the second floor, essentially, it's like if I'm not wrong, about 1,500 square feet of space, where we kind of converted it into uh, I think it was more like a co-living space before co-living became popular, right? Again, maybe we're a bit too ahead of our time, and we kind of had 12 beds in there, kind of split into 2 different big rooms, and then we had like a small kitchenette, a living room, and then the place was already fitted out with quite a few bathroom and shower units. And it had a huge balcony as well, right? Although in the end, the balcony wasn't used well, or effectively. And yeah, we ran that place for about 3, 4 years. And coincidentally, my that idea kind of sparked the whole home cleaning marketplace idea, that because I had issues trying to find services, right? Trying to find cleaning services for the space. I needed to find locksmiths. I needed to find painters and all kinds of these workers, right, to service my needs at a point in time. Yeah, so I think that came up. I think we ran it for about 4 years. In general, it was okay, but towards the end of 4 years, why we kind of shut it down is also because there were quite a few new dormitories that came up. So both the schools and then from the private side, there was a whole new university town that was just completed, because I think that was the start of the whole NUS Yale program. So they had a lot of new buildings built in, and then the students could then easily get dormitories at a point in time, right? So yeah, there was a it was a fun time. We had even kind of like parties with some of the tenants and then the students that stayed over. Interestingly, not just students stayed over in the hostel. We had some founders themselves that came and took up space.
Any notable ones that we'd recognize?
Not really. I think the founders, essentially, a lot of the founders were from overseas, right? And then they came to Singapore trying to figure out some interesting plays. And a couple came in because at a point in time, Singapore was very friendly to drones, right? So now it's really tough. I think that the restrictions are there and things like that, right? But I think back in the 2015s, 2016s, there were not much regulations. So a lot of drone founders came in trying to use Singapore as a test bed, right, to launch their startups. Yeah, so I think that there was quite a few good founders. In the end, it didn't they didn't do well themselves. in the startup space, but then we went on to explore other things, right? But they're also interesting, crazy founders, you know, that are willing to jump into the deep end, to do a lot of things and try it out. Yeah, but you meet a lot of people as part of this like enclave hostel project, right? And interestingly, I found a couple of interns for my startup at a point in time through that hostel as well.
That's what I love so much about learning from it. I think, one, I'm seeing a trend across your background that you were maybe a little early in all that you did between co-working, virtual toys, and I think that's just so tremendous. And then the other thing too that I love hearing you talk about is as you're innovating, as you're being an entrepreneur, you're always looking for more problems to solve, and what an incredible quality in any good founder or investor. Let's talk a little bit. So you've had so much experience founding different kinds of businesses that, you've raised a seed round, you've gone the VC backed route, you've also gone sort of the small, medium-sized business route with co-working locations and things like that. How did these experiences shape how you think about being on the side of the table now as an investor?
Yeah, so there are a lot of lessons that I've learned over the years with these different companies that I tried to create and grow unsuccessfully, but throughout an entire process, a couple of quick I mean, there are good learn lessons learned, right? So for example, uh, it's very easy to come up with an MVP, right? It's very easy to come up with a tech product, right? When I was building the Proper Hands, which is the cleaning service, cleaning marketplace itself, right? I hacked up a simple ordering service in I think a few weeks, and decided to just open it up to take orders, and but everything on the back end was just manual, right? Because when an order came in, I had to just start calling up, potential cleaners and my cleaning pool, just to get the matches to go ahead, right? And interestingly, my cleaners were on average 40 to 60-year-old ladies, right? And then they're not very tech savvy, right? So trying to build the tech for them on hindsight was a bit useless. It didn't help me. It didn't help the team with, let's say, reducing the operational work and increasing efficiency. But and it created more questions from them. How do I actually use this? How do I use the map? How do I check in and check out and things like that? And I had to also cater to also back then some of the older devices, right? So that means I got to cover a lot of platforms that didn't make sense for eventual growth, right? Yeah, so that's really first thing is, tech can be easily built, MVP can be easily built. So if a company comes and tell us that, hey, my moat, my competitive advantage is essentially because I'm the first mover, right? So unless it's, patented as algorithm that it's hard to reverse engineer, it's hard to build. A lot of the, Web 2 and currently a lot of new tech products, it can be copied very easily, right? So first thing, that's one. And secondly, my biggest I feel that my biggest learning back then is like because I graduated from NUS with computer science degree, right? So in my mind, I wanted to build something that people would like to use and be satisfied and happy using, right? But at the end of the day, tech isn't the solution to a lot of problems, right? Because we have to kind of think about the operations behind it, the people behind it. It's hard managing 100 plus 200 cleaners on my daily basis. And then, interestingly, some of them actually call in to our service line just to have a chat with us.
Oh, that's a first. I haven't heard that before.
So imagine, your Asian ladies, your Asian aunties, we call it. They're a bit they have no one to talk to for a while, or just for a while because they have other friends that they go to. But sometimes they just call us and they chit chat with our guys for like half an hour to an hour, right? And we like to act as a hotline, but then it takes time off our already small team. And although it helps us build relationship with them, at the end of the day, these relationships uh, help when we need maybe urgent requests, coming in, but it's also, maybe a double-edged sword, because that's where they get too chummy with you, and they try to request for special preferences in that sense, right? And hopefully, if you don't give it to them, they get angry and they might not work with you at the end of the day, because technically these people are not hired by us. They are, your contractors and your freelancers out there, your equivalents of it, right? So we don't control their time, we don't control their pay, and so on. Yeah. So these things, right? These are the main things that brought me to think, the human aspect of running a startup, especially a tech startup, is actually usually underestimated. So you got to
Mm.
deal with people, your customers, even your team members. Right? So these are things that actually create a lot of the most problems.
I can definitely agree with that from what I've seen between I think there's a statistic out there that even startups with co-founders are more likely to fail from due to co-founder disagreements. So whether it's on the leadership team, managing the team itself, or a pool of contractors, at the end of the day, we're all humans. Are there any signs that you've seen from founders who are or indications of them being strong at managing the human element early on?
There would be a couple, but there are not a lot of people that are being cut out to manage people, right? And that's where having, co-founders help, right? I mean, we say that you need to have an average like 2 to 3 co-founders on a founding team, so that each person can help address different aspects of the team, aspect of the company, right? So there should be someone good at building the product. There should be someone good at selling, and fundraising and things like that. And there should at least be one person that is good at operations, and that includes managing the team, hiring, and so on and so forth, right? So these then will be the people that are a bit more, um, I would say, understanding at least, or they're able to put their words across, and also kind of think logically in terms of how the team is growing, how the people aspect comes into play versus just the product side, as well as the sales and growth side, right? Because ideally, if you look at the sales and growth and the fundraising guy, these should be the visionaries, right? They are the ones trying to get out there, maybe even try to impress, use big words and use numbers to kind of get it out there. These are not your typical logical guys, right? Yeah, these are the guys that are thinking ahead. These are the guys that are trying to look at a big picture. They'll not look at operational stuff, and they don't want to kind of get inundated with the operational stuff, right? And they're not good at it. So don't let these guys look at all these operational issues. And then for the product guys, sometimes they can be the people person, right? But they are, I would say, over logical, and these are your tech folks, right? So it can be a mix of a couple of different personas in this case, but the only people that they might be good with is potential users, right? And sometimes they focus on that. They tie in potential customers with lines of code within the team itself. And then your operational guy, it's the guy that's usually um, underappreciated, right? And these can be
Mm.
a combination of operational, finance, and a few other guys. And these guys are usually the logical guys, the cool, calm thinking guys, and they are usually the gel across at least the founding team at first, and then for the rest of the growth of the company itself, right? And if the founders don't have that kind of background or that kind of skill sets, usually it's good to bring in an operational person as a founding team member, right, as early as possible.
I love that, and the visual that's coming to mind is this operations person is the foundation of the house, the product person's kinda building the house, and then the seller growth person is designing it, painting it, deciding what the front lawn looks like, what kind of
Yeah.
bricks to use for the sidewalk, and things like that. So, I love that visual, and I'll chime in to say that some of my favorite founders to work with are more of the product type that are very visionary with where it could go, that are super close to their users. They just so naturally are able to get feedback and to test new features. I was working with a founder this week who shared a new MVP confidentially with me, and he was showing how he tested it with his daughters, and it was the most you could see watch
Nice.
him light up and show how it was working. You could imagine in a sales presentation, you're almost in tears, you're ready to write the check, you wanna partner with this guy because he's so genuine and so excited about his product. And so out of the 3 that you mentioned, that's definitely, my favorite founder type to work with. So you must see so many founders, whether they have this team construction or not, especially investing early stage, which Plug and Play does. So tell us, how many pitch decks do you and your team review a month? I have to know.
Typically, I would say investors will invest around 0.1 to 0.5% of the companies they see in a year. All right.
Wow, that's a
So
small number.
it is a
0.1 to 0.5% of companies that they view. Wow.
yes. Right. So if the company is, investing in only 5 to 10 startups per year, right, then you can do the math and calculate backwards, right? Because if they do 0.1%, so every year they're probably looking at 1,000 to even 10,000 decks, right? Depending on the number of team members that they have, right? So if you kind of look at it, there are definitely different gates that they go through to filter out the startups. And by the time it comes to actual investments across the line, when it hit investment committee, it's like 70-80% that it will go through, right? So you can see that in the first probably two stages, a lot of startups are being cut and filtered out already.
How much time do you spend if you're looking at, let's say, 10,000 pitch decks a year, you must be spending minutes, if not maybe seconds on each review of a pitch deck?
So if you are, let's say, an entry level associate or an analyst in this case, that person is the one going through the most stacks, right?
Mhm.
If you are at, let's say, principal or partner level, number of decks that you go through, it's significantly lower, right? But you focus on the high quality ones, or from, let's say, key referrals and so on, right? So if you look at an analyst and associate, usually they will have to power through many decks per day. They probably spend, I would say, minutes on a single deck itself, right? Because what they go through will be, hey, uh, first thing, right, step by step, is the problem, does the problem even make sense? Is it a real problem, right? If it does, okay, now let me move to the next stage, like looking at the solution itself. Does the solution solve the problem itself? Is the solution a good solution? That is a good product? Can it scale? Right. If so, yes, then I move on to the next stage. So it's a very, I would say, logical step by step process, right? And then once something fails in the end, in the middle, I just throw away the deck and I look at the next one, right?
Mhm.
So if I'm a, let's say, a more senior person on the team, then I will probably look at some of the notes as well that come in from someone else that has processed it earlier than I do, right? And then I kind of validate it against the deck and also across some of the key points that I would like to focus on, right? So from my perspective, for example, I do look at some of the value add that we can actually provide to the
Mm.
investors, to the investees that we would if we were to eventually invest, and then what else could we help with? Is it the right point in time? My understanding of the market and the place where I'm investing in or the company is being based. So some of the higher level strategic areas. So these are the more senior folks with a bit more experience, they go through on a more regular basis itself, right? And finally, of course, does it make sense, or would it be easy for me to pass investment committee, right? Because we need to understand what the investment committee is looking at, right? So basically, all these key things would be what you know a typical process would look like. So that's there'll be like the analysts, they look at the first gate, or the first two gates, right? And then the partners, principals and partners will come in. and then before it hits, investment committee itself, right? So
Yeah.
this process can be fast if it's a really exciting startup that doesn't wait for us. Um, so fastest we've done probably a week or two, right? But typical process is usually about 3 months from our side.
Absolutely, and to go through each of the it sounds like the associates are checking to make sure this is a viable business, that it generally makes sense today. You're validating that as a more senior investment team, and then really thinking about how does a startup fit in our portfolio and the world that we see within venture. And I think that that's a really good shout out just for listeners to keep in mind when you are pitching different VCs. Of course, we want to know if you'll fit the theme, if you will have a viable business, but how does it actually fit into the broader portfolio? And how might you potentially even partner with other companies that an organization like Plug and Play has invested in? I think that that could be really interesting. So, when you've gone through this process with startups today, Wayne, are there any specific metrics or aspects of a business that you're particularly getting excited about? And maybe this is a good time to start talking about AI.
I think across a lot of industries, there are definitely different metrics that we look at. And the good thing, maybe the good and bad thing about Plug and Play is that we cover a lot of industry verticals, right? So it's we're not focused so much on the technology itself, but we're focused on the industry it's applied to, and also the corporate networks that we can bring in to support the startups at the end of the day, right? So because of that, there could be a AI maybe applied to 15 of the 20 plus industry verticals that we cover, right? Or almost everything, right? So how it applies, maybe from a B2B perspective, will be different from a B2C perspective, right? And some of the B2C perspectives will be probably easier to kind of put metrics on, right? So in the past, when I just started out, the whole SaaS Web 2 space was very hot, right? So I think there was, and it came out of Silicon Valley, right? The ideal growth rate for a SaaS company in especially in places like Silicon Valley, it's the triple 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 double double in terms of growth, annual growth in terms of revenue, right? So I see that being applied also to AI from B2C perspective nowadays. And I think there are some VCs in the Bay Area that are they're agreeing on that metrics, and they're catching that same growth rate as well. But at the end of the day, sometimes different markets will perform differently, right?
Mhm.
Because maybe in certain markets like Southeast Asia, your early adopters are not there, right? So how can your growth switch? Your metrics will have to switch, right? And according to see what could be a successful startup in itself, right? So instead of like the triple triples and the double doubles at the end, right? We could switch into a triple double, right? For example, and it's a good enough deal for us already, right? So some of these will be case by case, right? And then you kind of put different uh, combinations together in terms of technology, industry, as well as markets. All your metrics will change. But what we usually look at is, in general, a good traction, a good growth pipeline. And at least we show that we need to know that founders themselves are actively not just trying to build the product, but also trying to grow the users as well, right? So it should match with the market size that they're growing in.
Tell us a little bit more about growing not just the product, but also growing the users as well. I think that's a really important insight that I'd love to hear you talk a little bit more about.
Yeah, so I'm kind of referring a bit to more of the deep tech hardware space where traditionally this space has been longer to incubate, longer to grow, just because of the heavy tech that goes and heavy R&D that goes right at the beginning, right? So when you look at hardware design, there's too many things to look at, and you need to combine hardware with software at the end of the day as well. That's one example. Or if you look at, let's say, different deep tech stuff, like coming to biotech, coming to life sciences, and things like that. Um, a lot of these companies and startups from the early stage, they don't test with the users early enough, right? So they focus a lot on building the products, and I would say it's necessary. And also, the founding team members are mostly uh, the tech people, right? The PhDs, the scientists, and so on. They don't have time to bring in and think about users and growth right at the point in time, right? So, because of that, what I feel is that some of these founders, they bring in user feedback and market feedback a bit too late to make things work, especially from the VC perspective, right? When VCs come in, they do want to see, of course, the technology itself, how wonderful the product is, but also think about how this company can return the money back on their investments at the end of the day, because it's a money's game. So the focus then is right from the get-go, you know, one of the founders at least should even think about how this applies to whatever market segment that they're trying to target, and then even get some of the feedback from this market segment as early as possible. You might not be able to get, let's say, LOIs as early as you want to, but at least understand how the potential integration could be and focus on the different steps for different markets or segments, right? In that sense, so giving you an example is that towards the end of last year, we brought quite a lot of Korean startups to Singapore, right? So kind of trying to help them expand into the Southeast Asia market and using Singapore as a launch pad for that. Some of our mentors that work with the startups realize that the entire process flow or the user flow uh, compared to Korean market, Singapore is done very differently itself, right? So because of that, in order to get into a POC or a pilot, there has to have work done even before they come to Singapore, because they should already understand or try to understand how the typical product user flows across the entire technology itself, right? So that's where when you come here and talk about POC and pilots, your potential clients would be a bit more open to that, because it fits into what they do, right? And some work can already be done before these companies fly in, right? So that's one example that we look at. And but again, in generally in this space, especially for deep tech and hardware or anything more tech oriented at the beginning, we see some companies, they reach out to the customer base, or they try to figure out where the market is too late in the game.
Knowing your customer and being close to them continues to be one of the most important factors for success. You can build the most beautiful widget, and if no one knows how to use it, then it's useless, right? I get really excited though hearing about hardware specifically in deep tech. So earlier in our conversation, you mentioned that software, building an MVP for software, potentially, not, I'm not using your exact words, but is a little bit more of a shallow moat today than it used to be. Is that fair to say? Yeah. Hardware is still a pretty deep moat. You have to usually have patents, some level of expertise. It takes human time. There's manufacturing usually that's involved. It's not as easily replicatable, even with AI. As far as I know, AI isn't building our robots yet. So I would love to talk to you a little bit about moats. Software, shallow moat, hardware, deeper moat. What other moats are you seeing that exist more broadly in venture that are getting you excited today?
So let me clarify one point first, right? Even for software, there's varying degrees of difficulties, right? So for example, even for AI, if you're building your new foundation layers, for example, your new LLMs, your new models, and so on, that could be quite a significant moat, right, to it compared to your application layer, right, your agents and so on and so forth, right. But of course, we've seen that not to be the case in certain examples, like some of these AI companies in China coming up with new models in half the time at a fraction of the cost, right. So that's an example that in this case could be a possible moat, or it doesn't help with your whole defensibility at the end of the day. But for hardware, we usually see it different, right? Because there's a lot more physicality to the products itself. Sometimes you can reverse engineer it after, but that will be, when the product is already out in the market, or somehow you get access to maybe some of the prototypes and then things like that and figure it out. But usually it will take a longer time to, even figure out some of the IP that goes into the hardware itself, right? So what we are more excited about nowadays, and maybe this is also a plug for me, because one example is that we have just launched a partnership with the Amazon Devices team.
Wow, congratulations. That's a big
Thank
deal.
you. So it's we are partnering with them to run their climate tech accelerator program for this year, where they're really looking at technologies that they can work with to reduce the carbon footprint of the Amazon devices, right? So this is your typical Alexa, Ring, Echo, Kindles, and so on and so forth. So you can see that the interest in this space would predominantly be hardware basis, right? Or be hardware based, where they'll look at anything that goes into the electronics of the devices itself, the materials of the devices itself. So things like the displays, the chips, the semiconductor process of it. Of course, they also look at some of the manufacturing processes and maybe circularity of it. But the focus would definitely be more direct impacts, right? So given these, scopes and focus areas, if you look at companies that are building new materials that could use, they could have less carbon footprint, they could be more biodegradable. So there's usually a stronger special sauce and recipe that goes into the development of these recipes or these materials. So trying to kind of learn how they do it could you could do it, right? But eventually it will take time, right? And then some of the the different mixtures, the percentages that goes into for different materials being used could be different. The development in the whatever particular environment, for example, could be different, right? So trying to kind of figure that out in order to get something better would definitely take time and effort that sometimes no one else is going to do it, right? So that presents itself as definitely a stronger moat, right? But having said that, it is a stronger moat, but the success rate of these companies could be lower as well, right? Because it's tougher to get there in the first place. Yeah, but that's what I'm more exciting about. And we have a lot of companies in terms of corporate demand that is really currently looking at, how do you save more energy in any devices, in any electronics? How do you reduce the heat, for example, being created and generated, right? And sometimes that improves, let's say, the product lifespan itself. Sometimes it improves the user interaction of it, because you don't want to touch a device when it's really hot, right? So how do you actually either insulate users from heating batteries and chips and things like that, or how do you make it the user interaction more fun and more comfortable from these products and technology? Yeah, so quite a broad area in that sense, but that's where a lot of uh, developments are going into, and especially I don't want to sound like a broken record, but from the AI space, physical AI and embodied AI is somehow one of the key focuses maybe this year, or starting from towards the end of last year. Right, so things like robotic arms, humanoid robots, and stuff like that. It's still quite early, but everyone is starting to think about applications in the industry itself. So those parts of it will be really tough to kind of build and define the IP itself, because there are many parts and components that go into such a hardware device, and there's strength from each company that we've seen in the market, right? But at the end of the day, whether they can find product market fit, whether they can find a system that could help aggregate their products into something bigger or into a final product. Um, the jury's still out there for many companies.
Again, I think it's a really exciting place to play as a business model fanatic. I love the idea of hardware as a moat. Again, to your point, in theory, you could potentially pull apart prototypes, but even with different technological advances that we're seeing in venture, it's so much harder to replicate hardware today than it is basic software, not LLMs and other sort of digital infrastructure, but more application layer bases. Which, as an aside, one of the reasons, maybe this is for another conversation, I also get really excited about distribution moats of how you're selling your product. And so, back to what Wayne was sharing earlier, really understanding what that go to market motion looks like is imperative. And making sure that you're close to your customers even before you decide to charge them so that it's no surprise how you're coming to market, what you're charging, how you're charging it, how they're going to get it and implement it into their system. They're just waiting for that inevitable moment. So a couple closing questions for you, Wayne. If you had a magic wand, which is my favorite start to every question because I always wish I had a magic wand, but if you had a magic wand, what is one thing you'd wish founders would do more of?
I do say this a lot to founders, especially during the early stages when I meet them, or when I train and go through some of the workshops with them. Main thing for founders I always like to say is don't fundraise for the sake of fundraising, right? That's a key point that I don't really like to see founders coming in to say, "Hey, I just need X amount of money because my company is worth this amount of money." When firstly, you might not be at the right time, or you don't really actually need the money. And what's wrong with running an SME, right? So, and not everyone firstly needs to go down that path, or not everyone has the ability to go down that path, right? So don't think about fundraising and getting into the numbers game, because once you get external money, the pressure comes, right? And the clock starts ticking, and then you have limited time to raise your next round of funding, right? Or to even get to the exit at the end of the day. So I mean, we see a lot of success cases on media because it's what media is being designed to do, right? And make you have that bit of FOMO. But life is not just about chasing that exit dream and the valuation dream itself.
I could do a standing ovation over here if it wouldn't deafen everyone on my microphone. I love to hear this. I think, this is a discussion I have with founders all the time. One, do you need venture capital? And that's cloaked in, are you prepared to create a business that could 1000x every dollar that an early stage investor gives to you? If you think the answer to that question is yes, are you ready for the impact that it might have on your life? Startups are staying private longer than ever in the United States. I think the average is almost 15 years now. That's 15 years of running a business, of responding to a high pressure, high growth focused board and preparing for an IPO. So this is a conversation we have quite often. And then the other really fascinating insight that I love to hear you talk about, Wayne, is also this concept of, do you really need the money? I find that when founders are so focused, if I only got this check, everything would align. My user insights would fall out of, the clouds, and my hardware, we'd finally figure out how to get that humanoid to put the milk carton on the warehouse shelf properly. Whenever I get into those conversations, I always ask, like, if you weren't to get money in the next 12 months for some reason, what is your plan to continue to build the business? And for me, that's an exercise in radical prioritization. Are they thinking of the right things to do within marketing, the right things to do within go to market? Are they prepared to sit with their customers and figure out, how do we start monetizing this just to break even to get to that next phase of the tech growth? How are they really becoming that central focus for their niche in their industry? And so, this question about fundraising, there's so much that you can learn when you have it with founders. And I agree with you. We should be chasing much more than headlines, because if you do decide to raise that venture capital, then that's just the start of the journey. That is definitely not the end.
Yeah, and that's coming up from, predominantly where I'm based, like Southeast Asia. And that's where, if you see and if you look at the whole fundraising winter, right? The whole funding winter in the region itself is not just because of global impacts and stuff like that. No, there's probably some factors attributing to that, right? But at the end of the day, right, if you're a startup or founder in Southeast Asia trying to raise funds and run a startup, your access to funds compared to someone in Silicon Valley is much lower, right? And because of that as well, your access to a potential eventual exit is much lower as well. So, unless you're gonna kind of uproot yourself or your entire team and move it to the Bay Area to then be crowded in the whole competitive landscape, then your whole game plan is going to be different, right? So when you're in a more pragmatic market, you really need to think more pragmatically, right? So I think that's how it should be, coming from the other side of the pond, essentially.
I would love to echo this advice though for US-based founders. Today, so much of venture capital is still going to AI and robotic solutions. So if you're not in a pure play differentiated AI space, or if you don't have hardware that's considered exciting in our space today, like humanoids and manufacturing, we keep talking about that. Fundraising can be much more challenging, even if you do have strong underlying financial metrics and a really strong product vision in your industry. And so I would encourage a lot of founders to just think a little bit more sustainably around growth, either to buy your time to the next raise a little bit better, or, just to have more optionality if you're early on and haven't raised venture capital funding yet. It's always easier to raise when you have more metrics to raise off of. Thank you so much, Wayne. I guess my final question is, are virtual toys going to make a comeback? Are we going to do that again?
I don't know. I'm really out of touch with that space already, and I'll also probably realize that that's not my forte. So I'm not gonna touch virtual toys quite a bit from now on.
All right. So if I see a virtual toy startup, I won't be calling you for expert insights on the
Yeah.
space. Got it. Well, thank you so much for joining us today. This has been such a wealth of information. We're so grateful to have you. Your global perspectives from Silicon Valley to Asia and beyond are so helpful. And I know that the listeners will find this conversation really inspiring. So thank you so much, Wayne. And I'm so grateful I get to see you in person soon.